Masrouk was in a pleasant mood as he made his way through the streets of Dalaran toward the Alliance Defense Forces headquarters near the Violet Citadel. A few months had passed since Masrouk joined the newly formed organization, and he was very pleased with how things had developed. Combat-focused members of the Alliance Defense Force were all requisitioned with the best possible equipment that the organization could acquire, which turned out to be quite impressive. Krivax had gone out of his way to ensure all members of the Alliance contributed to their logistics, and it showed. Masrouk still felt as happy as a hatchling who'd weaved his first web whenever he recalled receiving his new equipment. Superior dwarfish metal crafting combined with the unified efforts of enchanters from Azjol Nerub, Dalaran, and Quel'Thalas, resulted in armaments beyond what any of them could create on their own. His new obsidian black armor was crafted from a titanium mithril alloy and seamlessly melded with his crimson exoskeleton, its interlocking plates each glowing faintly with magic. The silk harness attached to the armor made it convenient to access his equipment even when using his new wings. His helmet, designed with multifaceted eye and antennae openings, completed his armor well and created an awe-inspiring appearance that drew the attention of anyone who saw him. His armor's enchantments, many of which would have conflicted with each other before the Alliance's collaborative efforts, had many useful functions. Defensive enchantments along the breastplate, vision-improving magic in the helmet, and best of all, complex weight negation enchantments along his wing guard that made him light enough to properly fly. Such maneuverability offered Masrouk many new options in a fight. He now loved to soar across the red skies in the early sunrise and breathe in the fresh sea breeze off the coast of Northrend whenever he returned to Azjol Nerub. His spear, previously the same as the standard equipment given to the Dreadstalkers, had been similarly improved. Imbued with dwarvish enchantments that would allow the spear to return to him after being thrown and sharp enough to pierce through most armor, Masrouk was now more deadly than he had ever been. If he'd had this equipment when he and Krivax had fought that troublesome demon, they could have defeated it much more quickly. Masrouk hadn't originally seen the purpose of the Alliance Defense Force when Krivax had explained his idea, though he'd kept that to himself. Krivax had always possessed an unique vision and perspective that allowed him to see how things could be, rather than how they were, so he'd trusted his friend's judgment. Now that Krivax's vision was beginning to become reality, Masrouk better understood the wisdom behind a collaborative defense initiative. Masrouk was pulled from his thoughts as he approached his destination. The Alliance had chosen Dalaran as the place to build its headquarters due to its relative historical neutrality when it came to matters of politics. Grand Magus Antonidas had personally created the spatial enchantments on the structure, which meant the Alliance Defense Force had more than enough space to conduct its operations. The structure itself was nothing special, simply being one of the larger buildings in the city's administrative district, but the many personnel walking in and out were diverse even by Dalaran's standards. Every race in the Eastern Kingdoms, along with Nerubians and even the occasional Tauren or Drenii, could be seen going about their diplomatic duties. The only reason Masrouk drew any attention as he passed beneath the Alliance banner hanging above the entrance was due to his large wings and imposing armor. Masrouk quickly walked past the many diplomats and emissaries stationed in the main hall, heading directly toward the more militarized western wing of the building. He then ended up spending several minutes being closely examined by the Dreadstalker and Spellbreaker guards stationed by the entrance. Although Krivax may have grown accustomed to going wherever he pleased as he interacted with the most powerful people in Azeroth, Masrouk had no such luxury despite their friendship. This didn't bother him at all, as Masrouk honestly preferred to go unnoticed by the people in Krivax's orbit. It made his life much easier. Soon enough, Masrouk was given the all-clear and allowed entrance to the western wing. The atmosphere immediately changed as he stepped inside. Krivax had not wasted any time in getting things organized and began sending people out on missions as soon as possible. Apparently, he wanted the organization to gain some experience before they were deployed against a powerful necromancer on some foreign continent. Masrouk had worried at first that there would not be enough missions available and that he would be deprived of a proper fight, but that proved an unnecessary concern. There seemed to be a truly absurd number of threats plaguing Azeroth, so there was more than enough work to keep even the most battle-hungry warriors satisfied. As Masruk walked through the halls toward the training area, he passed by several unique individuals, many of whom he would not have encountered anywhere else. He paused briefly in the hallway as he watched the mutated Draenei known as Broken, a Karma, practicing in the courtyard. Masruk had never fought a Karma himself, but he'd seen the Broken spar against the Paladin Tyrion Fordring in the training area and knew that he was highly skilled. Masruk wasn't sure how Krivax did it, but he just seemed to know many obscure individuals of exceptional skill and had a knack for recruiting them. However, the ADF wasn't filled with only a few highly skilled combatants, but also had many other personnel available to offer support. After all, even the most elite of soldiers would become several times more effective with the assistance of specialists. As if reading his thoughts, his attention was drawn to one such individual calling for his attention. Masruk. Over here. Masruk turned to see a burly human man in robes embroidered with nautical sigils. The staff he held was adorned with shells and glowing with a soft, water light. Wavespeaker Samuel was among the few Tidesages remaining after Kultiras finished purging the organization of Void cultists after their betrayal during the Second War. "Greetings, Tidesage, how can I help you?" Masruk asked as he approached Samuel and a young half-elf man from the logistics department. The Tidesage chuckled warmly before responding. "Oh, relax. You spiderfolk are always too proper. No need for formality among friends and comrades, no? I see you have fully recovered from the blow from the falling mast." The Tidesage had been very helpful during Masruk's first mission for the ADF, which involved investigating the growing pirate threat plaguing the Eastern Kingdoms. They had together caught up to the pirate ship and boarded it. In spite of the pirate captain's attempt to crush him under one of the masts, he had shrugged off the cracked carapace and cornered him with his spear, while Samuel had swamped the deck clear of other pirate crew with a massive wave. Working with the different Alliance members in his missions had helped him to appreciate the strange friendliness among the surface races. "Very well, Samuel," said Masruk, attempting to sound less formal. "Is there something that you need? I wish to meet with my assigned team before the next mission briefing later this evening." "Certainly, that's the very reason why I called for you," said Samuel, smiling affably as he leaned against his staff. "Mere moments ago Elmir and I were discussing this upcoming mission and what it might entail when I saw you. Given that not every soul here shares kinship with the one at the helm, it seemed prudent to ask you." "You are friends with Vizier Krivax?" asked the half-elf named Elmir, his eyes widening with interest. "That's amazing. I was only able to speak with him for a few minutes when I was first recruited. He was very intimidating." Masruk was not surprised by the half-elf's interest. Krivax might not fully understand what kind of a figure he'd become, but Masruk was accustomed to people showing an interest in their friendship. After all, who wouldn't be curious about a person who regularly spoke with rulers? It didn't help that Krivax casually radiated power ever since he had been empowered by Alexstrasza. "Krivax is kind, but very busy," Masruk said to Elmir before turning his attention back to Samuel. "I do not know what the mission will entail exactly, but I suspect that it will involve the necromancer known as the Lich King." It was a lie that Masruk didn't know the contents of his mission, but there was no harm in mentioning the Lich King. Preparations to face the undead had been growing significantly over the past few weeks, with the Church of the Holy Light infusing large numbers of armaments with the light. While it wasn't public knowledge, Masruk even knew that Krivax had been in close contact with Archmage Kel'Thuzad about an anti-undead weapon that the mage had successfully developed with the assistance of Queen Kha'Tix. I suppose that makes sense," said Samuel, a bitter look crossing his expression. "It seems like every day now that we're facing a new threat, more deadly than the last. I remember when the worst things I had to worry about were pirates and Gilnean saber rattling. Now half my order revealed themselves as mind-eating monsters, and armies of the undead are terrorizing distant lands. I miss when times were simpler." That was a sentiment that Masruk had come across many times, not only from the surface races but also from his fellow Nerubians. Personally, Masruk didn't enjoy imagining what his life would have been like without Krivax in it and all the changes that resulted. He would have never met the people of Kamagwa or seen the forests of Kalimdor. He would have never battled the Horde or sparred with some of the most skilled warriors in the Eastern Kingdoms, such as Paladin Uther. Instead, Masruk would have almost certainly lived in the depths of Kilakuk as a warrior and eventually died there without seeing a single star. That was why Masruk found it hard to share their sentiment. Still, it was easy to understand their perspective. I miss those times too. I thank the light every day that I wasn't in Capital City when that giant abomination destroyed my home, said Elmir, nodding solemnly in agreement before seeming to perk himself up. But it is nice that there are so many new kinds of people to see now. I actually saw a giant bird person entering the Violet Hold yesterday. Apparently, they were brought to our world from Draenor by the dragons. Samuel and Elmir continued to gossip as they continued discussing new rivals and the other events unfolding across Azeroth. Masruk decided to stay and listen for a while despite already knowing far more than either of them about the state of the world thanks to Krivax. He felt that it was important to understand what the common people without insider information were thinking and feeling. Masruk had noticed that Krivax sometimes overlooked that perspective, absorbed with his diplomatic duties and focusing on a goal only he could see. There weren't many ways that Masruk could assist his friend, but the occasional reminder of how those around him felt was useful. Samuel and Elmir mentioned several interesting anecdotes, such as the growing number of elvish merchants selling exciting new goods. Krivax had been focusing recently on managing diplomatic relations with Quel'Thallars, often bemoaning their growing influence and the state of their internal politics. As far as Masruk understood, the elvish equivalent of the High King had been steadily losing power over the past few years before the situation culminated several months ago. He could tell that Krivax was very concerned about this, even going so far as to wonder if Deathwing's children or the Dreadlords were involved in the matter. Masruk got the impression that this wasn't the only thing bothering Krivax, as he seemed to be paying closer attention to Azul Nerub's internal politics as well. There was little Masruk could do about it, but he still memorized everything Samuel and Elmir said for later. He could always ask Krivax questions about anything that he did not fully understand. Aside from that, they also mentioned several recent technological innovations. These mostly focused on mundane inventions such as a new refrigeration device created by the elvish enchantments, heated blankets made using fire-imbued silks, and gnomish silk-wired street lamps that were easy to produce in bulk. Eventually, Masruk couldn't afford to stay any longer and said goodbye to the pair before continuing on his way. Several more personnel attempted to catch his attention as he passed through the corridors, either to exchange pleasantries or inquire about the upcoming mission. Masruk was polite but brief, uninterested in wasting any more time. When he finally reached the main courtyard, a sprawling space filled with various sparring rings, target ranges, and golems built specifically to withstand powerful attacks, he quickly began searching for the ones he would be joining on his next mission. It didn't take long to do so, as Vizier Haedix and Paladin Fordring were facing each other in a large, circular sparring ring that was encased by an arcane barrier. Masruk was not surprised to see that Vizier Haedix was testing the skills of the human who would be fighting by their side. He'd always known the older Nerubian to be strict in ensuring the competency of those around him. Even now, he could still remember the time Haedix had discreetly pulled Masruk aside a few days before he first went to the surface with Krivax. The Vizier had insisted that Masruk prove himself worthy of accompanying his apprentice. It had not been particularly pleasant. Masruk was even more wary of Vizier Haedix in recent times, as the older Nerubian seemed particularly irritable that he was unable to continue his typical duties. This irritation was very clearly being taken out on Paladin Fordring, who was doing a surprisingly good job of enduring it. Masrouk watched as Vizier Haedix launched a barrage of arcane missiles which flew around the sparring ring and attacked Fordring from every angle while simultaneously creating several illusions of himself to deceive the paladin's senses. It was a multifaceted attack that would have overwhelmed many warriors, but Fordring defended himself admirably. The human swiftly erected a barrier of light around himself that deflected the magical attacks before stomping on the ground and unleashing a wave of holy energy that left the ground glowing and destroyed all of the illusions. With his true enemy revealed, Fordring didn't hesitate to charge Vizier Haedix with his warhammer raised high, his speed blisteringly fast as the human empowered himself with the light. Masrouk noticed approval in Vizier Haedix's expression even as the powerful mage teleported away moments before being struck and continued his attacks. Masrouk was grateful that the human had earned the vizier's regard, knowing that Haedix would be exceedingly unpleasant if he was forced to travel with a group he didn't respect. Watching the display, it was relieving to know that he and Vizier Haedix already had an understanding. Truthfully, Masrouk and Haedix had both already been briefed on this mission, so he knew that Fordring's combatability had not been the primary reason that the paladin had been chosen. Instead, it was mostly due to his expertise in healing and the nearly non-existent chance that he had been compromised by the Burning Legion. After all, secrecy would be absolutely essential if this strange group of theirs was to succeed. Masrouk continued watching for a few more moments before deciding to introduce himself to the human. Masrouk walked over to the sparring ring and waited on its edges, knowing that both Haedix and Fordring had noticed his presence and would end their fight soon. Sure enough, after a few more dazzling exchanges, Fordring motioned for a pause before glancing at Masrouk as he wiped the sweat from his brow. After making his way to a short pedestal on the edge of the sparring ring and speaking a brief incantation, Haedix lowered the arcane barrier that enclosed the arena. "I trust that you're satisfied, Vizier?" Fordring asked, casting a quick healing spell on himself that seemed to alleviate his exhaustion. Haedix gave a single nod of approval before responding. "You possess adequate skill and tenacity, Paladin. I suspect that you have the potential to become a truly formidable warrior should you survive the coming years. You will be of use in our upcoming endeavor." From what he had been able to observe, Masrouk agreed with the vizier's assessment. Fordring fought with a level of skill and resolve that reflected a lifetime of training. If he hadn't become a lifeweaver, Masrouk doubted that he would have been able to keep up with the human, even with his enchanted gear. "Thank you, Vizier. I shall do my best to meet your expectations," Fordring said politely, inclining his head toward Haedix before turning to Masrouk. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I am Paladin Tyrion Fordring. It's a pleasure to meet you." Lifeweaver Masrouk, he introduced himself simply, stretching out an arm to greet the human in the manner of one of their strange customs. Vizier Haedix wordlessly passed the two of them, obviously uninterested in further introductions. "Your reputation precedes you. I've heard many stories about you swooping down onto a ship owned by the Blackwater Raiders and capturing its captain," said Fordring, a wide smile on his face as he shook Masrouk's hand. "It sounds like a riveting tale." Masrouk decided that he liked Tyrion Fordring. Most people usually only knew Masrouk through his connection to Krivax, so it felt good to be acknowledged by such a skilled warrior. The event that Fordring was referring to was his very first mission for the ADF, in which he'd been tasked with capturing a pirate captain alive and delivering them to the Alliance. The Blackwater Raiders had been harassing Stormwind's coast some time, and the kingdom was too busy rebuilding after the Second War to invest significant resources to stopping them. "I could not have done it without assistance," Masrouk said honestly, knowing that it was the truth. "If Wavespeaker Samuel had not summoned a mist to obscure my escape, then their rifles would have been much more of a threat." Masrouk couldn't help but chuckle as he recalled how the pirate had screamed, his entire body encased in webs as he dangled through the air. Fordring laughed heartily after hearing Masrouk describe the scene. "Oh, I would have enjoyed being able to witness that. It sounds like quite the spectacle." The two of them continued to speak for several more minutes, exchanging stories of past missions and the challenges they faced. Masruk found himself appreciating the humans' easy manner and sincerity, hoping the two of them would have more missions in the future. Their conversation was only interrupted when a gnome messenger approached and informed them that they were needed in the primary briefing room. The gnome left after ensuring that they had properly understood the message, likely to inform the other teams about the situation. With a quick nod to each other, Masruk and Tyrion began making their way to the meeting room. It quickly became clear that everyone had been given orders of some kind, because the corridors were a hive of activity as people rushed to and fro. The primary briefing room was already full once they arrived, several teams waiting around a large table covered in magical artifacts. An arcane projection of the continent known as Pandaria filled the air above it, clearly indicating to everyone that it would be the focus of their upcoming mission. The projection was marked with various symbols and annotations, indicating key positions and objectives. Masruk wasn't particularly familiar with Pandaria, but it wasn't hard to guess that the red portions of the map represented the territory conquered by the Scourge. Given that the vast majority of the continent's coast seemed to be included in these areas, the situation was obviously quite dire. Masruk spotted Krivak standing at the front of the table and waiting patiently for everyone to arrive before beginning the briefing. He couldn't help but note that Krivak was far less nervous than he would have been if he had been placed in this kind of situation just a few years ago. There were many parts of Krivak that had stayed the same since they were hatchlings, but his confidence had clearly grown over the years. Masruk knew that Krivak wouldn't agree with his assessment, but his friend had always been unnecessarily hard on himself. As he and Fordring made their way over to the portion of the table where Vizier Haedix was waiting, Masruk turned his attention to the other teams. Unfortunately, it seemed like he was among the last few to arrive, so there was little opportunity to evaluate the members of the other teams in detail. Once everyone had settled, Krivak stepped forward, clearing his throat to get the room's attention. "Thank you all for gathering here. We have little time to waste on formalities, so I'll get straight to the point," Krivak said confidently, gesturing toward the arcane projection. "Most of you are already well aware of this, but I will explain for those of you who are not. The continent of Pandaria, a landmass in the South Sea hidden by ancient magic, has been attacked by a necromancer known as the Lich King. If this necromancer is allowed to grow his undead armies unopposed, they will swiftly become a threat to the entirety of Azeroth. This cannot be allowed." Krivak continued sharing what was known about the Lich King, including their origins with the Burning Legion and ability to control unprecedented numbers of undead. Krivak also spent time discussing the Dreadlords and their abilities, as well as Lord Malagos' belief that the demons were the ones in true control of the Lich King. By the time he was done, the importance of the demons was exceedingly clear. Masruk saw several people grow grim as they studied the projection. Many of them held politically important positions and thus had been informed of the Lich King by the Alliance, but it was clear that the severity of the situation was worse than they had expected. Krivak eventually went on to explain that after Malagos gained access to Pandaria, he and the Blue Dragonflight made significant efforts to scout the continent and locate the Lich King. Unfortunately, the Necromancer's mobile fortress had not been seen at any point during these past few months, and the Aspect eventually had decided that he could not wait any longer. Every day that went by was another that the Scourge grew in numbers, so putting a stop to their rampage across Pandaria was a necessity. Such a massive endeavor would of course need to be handled by the actual militaries of the Alliance's member nations. It would not be an easy fight given that transporting large numbers of troops would be a logistical nightmare. Sea transport was tantamount to suicide, while moving so many troops by portal would exhaust the most powerful of mages and consume precious resources to keep the portals open. It was only due to the assistance of the Aspect of magic that it was even remotely possible. Krivak pointed to a particular part in northern Pandaria where the Alliance would be establishing a forward base. A combined effort by the Guardians of Nerub, Order of the Silver Hand, and the most elite warriors in Quel'Thalas would be leading the initial assault. During this time, the available Aspects and Dragonflights would launch a surprise attack on the Isle of Thunder, hoping to destroy the Scourge's leadership on Pandaria. Masruk thought it was a sound tactic. Even if they were to fail, The attack would at least distract the Scourge from the Alliance's assault. This was what the Alliance would be doing, but there was an important role for the ADF to play as well. Lord Malygos is very concerned that the enemy will use his and the other aspects' distraction to launch attacks at poorly defended locations, Krivax continued solemnly, his eyes sweeping through the room. As a result, most of you will be held in reserve to respond to such an eventuality. The Council of Six has offered the assistance of the most powerful spatial mages in Dalaran to quickly transport you where it is necessary at a moment's notice. Krivax gestured to a figure who Masruk recognized to be Archmage Ansiram. He recognized the wisdom of this decision as well. Masruk could already imagine an army of the undead emerging from the sea and devastating the Kultiras fleets in a surprise attack or destroying the still rebuilding Stormwind before anyone could respond. Having several groups of highly powerful individuals to push back against an assault would undoubtedly be very useful. Fortunately, Masruk grew increasingly confident that the Alliance was taking this threat very seriously the longer he listened to Krivax. Aside from the teams prepared to respond to the Lich King, Quel'Thalas had also prepared several dozen magisters to intervene as soon as necessary. Such a large number of mages had the potential to turn the tide of any battlefield. However, some of you have been selected for a different mission, Krivax continued once he finished explaining the reserve strategy. Specifically, the teams led by Archmage Crossus and Vizier Hadix will be deploying to Pandaria as soon as the assault begins. These two teams will be receiving a separate briefing at the conclusion of this meeting. Now, any questions? The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of the situation settled on everyone present. This briefing had made clear that this would be the largest military conflict that any of them would be participating in since the Second War. Yes, Magus Ronan? Krivax nodded to the human mage. What support can we expect from the native inhabitants of Pandaria? Asked Ronan, his voice measured. A good question, Krivax said before launching an in-depth explanation of Pandaria's current situation and the state of their resistance. That resistance almost entirely relied on a few powerful creatures known as the August Celestials and a small group of elite warriors called the Shadow Pan. Masruk had already heard from Krivax that the Pandaran did not have a standing army, but it still made little sense to him. Azrael Nerub had been at peace for even longer than the Pandaran, but they had always maintained a capable military throughout its history. The idea of relying on a few so-called wild gods and a small organization for protection seemed entirely nonsensical to him. A quick look around the room made it obvious that his sentiment was shared by the rest of the people in the room. The Eastern Kingdoms was not a peaceful continent, so this was to be expected. Krivax also went on to explain the threat of the Shah, which were apparently hostile void entities which would spontaneously appear in places of significant negative emotion. Given the circumstances, Masruk was not surprised when Krivax pointed to large splotches of purple across the projection that represented the Shah. Krivax also took a moment to mention Mantifes, a sister kingdom to Azrael Nerub that existed on the western side of the continent. If they were any bit as formidable as his own people, then Masruk thought the Alliance would be wise to avoid them as much as possible. Masruk listened carefully as Krivax spent the next half an hour answering various questions. Eventually, Krivax concluded the general meeting, indicating that it was time for the two specific teams to receive their separate, mission-critical briefings. If there are no further questions, I would like Vizier Hadix's to stay behind while Archmage Crossus' team goes to meet Magister Romarth in his office, Krivax announced, his eyes briefly flickering to Masruk before returning to the rest of the room. Everyone else, thank you for your time. The assault on Pandaria will take place at the end of the week. The Lich King will almost certainly respond once Lord Malygos begins his attack, so I suggest you do everything you can to prepare until then. The room began to empty as everyone filed out, leaving behind a hushed air. Archmage Crossus nodded at Krivax before leaving with his team, a group of several mages who Masruk didn't recognize, to meet with Magister Romarth. Soon enough, the only people left in the room were Krivax, Masruk and his team, as well as a strange female dwarf who had been quiet throughout the entire briefing. Krivax waited until the door closed behind the departing teams and Hadix finished casting what was most likely a privacy ward before addressing the remaining members of the room. "All right," Krivax began, taking a deep breath as he turned to face Fordring. "While I did say that this briefing was for your entire team, in truth, you are the only person here who does not know what you've been gathered to do. Masruk, Vizier Hadix, and Watcher Ionaya were all informed before this meeting." Masruk couldn't help but turn a curious glance to the stoic dwarf woman. Ionaya was the name of the giant golem creature from Udaman that Krivax had told him about. Fordring looked a bit surprised, but not affronted. "I see. Then this mission must be extremely sensitive in nature. What is it that you need from me?" "As I said before, this team will be one of the few traveling to Pandaria," said Krivax after a moment of silence. "Your objective will be to carry out a plan crafted by Lord Malygos. One that will hopefully result in the successful capture of a dreadlord." Masruk heard the sharpness in Krivax's voice and knew how much the success of this mission meant to his friend. Dethierok's escape with potentially vital information had left a bad taste in both of their mouths, so finding a way to turn the tables on the enemy would be immensely satisfying. Not only that, but this would be one of their few opportunities to seize the initiative from the enemy and take the fight directly to them. "I am not the most familiar with demons, but even I know that dreadlords are particularly cunning creatures," Fordring said, his hint of skepticism in his voice. "How exactly do we plan to capture one, and why was I chosen to participate?" "Capturing the demon will be the responsibility of Watcher Ionaya," Krivax explained, gesturing to the individual in question. "Lord Malygos and Keeper Archidas have developed an artifact which will prevent the Dreadlord from returning to the Twisting Nether. Ionaya's duty will be to operate it." Krivax then went on to give a quick explanation of who and what Ionaya was, which Fordring accepted with impressive composure. "As for why you were chosen," Krivax continued, locking eyes with Fordring. "It's simple. You fit a very specific criteria of being trustworthy, not already occupied with other obligations, and being extremely effective against the undead. Once you are equipped with the Silver Hand, I expect that effectiveness to increase substantially." Masruk heard the slight sulk in Krivax's voice and nearly chuckled. He knew his friend had wanted to surprise the paladin by giving him the Silver Hand personally, but hadn't been able to arrange it. Krivax was quite fond of dramatic moments. However, Fordring already seemed sufficiently impressed, his eyes growing wide with awe. "The Silver Hand? Archbishop Benedictus has agreed to entrust me with such a legendary artifact?" Fordring asked, his voice tinged with disbelief and honor. "He has. The Archbishop is prepared to hold a secret ceremony to bestow the artifact to you after this meeting," Krivax said approvingly, clearly happy with the human's reaction. "You will likely need to spend the next few days acclimating to its power, but it will be vital for ensuring that all of us survive this mission. I hope you can handle this responsibility, Paladin Fordring." Fordring straightened his posture, his eyes filled with conviction. "I will do my utmost to wield the Silver Hand with the honor and dignity it deserves, and for the betterment of us all. You have my word." Masruk didn't really understand the light, but the swell of energy that seemed to emanate from the human at that moment spoke volumes about his conviction. In that moment, he could easily imagine the paladin wielding the weapon that had slain a Cathrax and destroying entire swaths of undead with indomitable will. Masruk had already considered Fordring a formidable warrior, but his estimation of the paladin rose even further, and he wondered how his friend had known that this specific human would be so well suited for the mission. A quick glance at Krivax revealed the familiar glimmer in his eyes of a plan coming together, and Masruk decided that it didn't matter. He trusted Krivax's judgment in matters such as these. "Very good," said Krivax, sounding distinctly pleased. "Then let me share the details of our plan. If you all manage to succeed, then this could potentially be our first step in turning the tides against the Lich King." Malygos didn't often use magic to split his mind into multiple instances, despite the undeniable usefulness of doing so. Even for someone as skilled with magic as himself, such magic came with distinct risks. His history of Minor mental instability only aggravated those risks to unacceptable. However, temporary moments like these, when he needed to simultaneously attend to multiple important tasks, made him grateful to have such abilities at his disposal. Currently, Malygos had a rare guest in his lair in the form of Alexstrasza. The two of them were wearing their mortal guises as they listened to Krivax deliver a report on the ongoing mortal operations in Pandaria. The operation was in its preliminary stages, with the Alliance gradually transferring personnel to the continent via portal and establishing a base of operations on the continent. This stage would last until the Alliance's actions were discovered by the enemy, at which point they would transition into a full assault. Once that happened, Malygos and Alexstrasza would then lead an assault by the Dragonflights on the Scourge's stronghold on the Isle of Thunder. A multi-pronged attack was the best way to utilize their element of surprise, as their enemy should have little to no warning that they'd managed to bypass Pandaria's concealments. This was why the two of them were currently waiting in Malygos' lair. Teleporting two people to a precise location several thousand miles away was already a difficult task. When you included the general interference being caused by the growing void corruption in Pandaria and a lack of familiarity with the destination, even the aspect of magic needed to prepare a ritual in the corner of his lair. He and Alexstrasza were fully prepared to begin the assault at a moment's notice. Malygos had to admit that he was somewhat looking forward to the matter. It had been a long time since Azeroth had borne witness to the full might of a dragonflight. Those green-skinned mortals had surrendered far too quickly for his liking, after all. This was a convenient opportunity to give the world a reminder of who exactly they were dealing with. However, that wasn't the only matter which demanded his attention at this moment. In the portion of his lair where he kept the majority of his enchanted instruments, Malygos was engrossed in his work. These devices, arrayed with meticulous care, served to analyze and gauge various magical phenomena. One particular device was levitating the body of a female Pandaran, who had been killed by the Scourge, steadily in the air before him. Malygos wouldn't normally look twice at a dead mortal, but the manner in which this one had been killed grew more concerning the longer he studied it. Not only was the corpse covered in crimson pustules that seeped a watery red fluid, but it was also twisted and deformed in an unnatural manner. Despite being magically preserved only a few moments after death, the mortal's fur was already matted and falling out in clumps, revealing discolored skin showing signs of advanced necrosis. Its snout was elongated and pulled back in a silent snarl, revealing more teeth than Pandaran should possess, while its limbs were knotted and gnarled like the roots of a diseased tree. Malygos had long since been aware that the Lich King and the demons controlling them could potentially make use of magical diseases. Krivax's description of the so-called plague of undeath that turned mortals directly into undead had made that perfectly clear. However, Malygos' analysis of the matter had determined that the creation of such a terrible affliction would have taken even the Lich King significant time to perfect. Studying the corpse made it clear to him that those efforts were further along than Malygos had anticipated. Traces of both demonic and necromantic magic could be sensed in the corpse, along with nearly imperceptible hints of something much more out of place. Malygos was surprised to find even the smallest amount of life magic weaved into the plague's magical signature, but every examination affirmed that to be the case. Malygos didn't like it when his enemies did things that didn't make sense. It usually meant that they had done something annoyingly clever and were about to make his life far more difficult than necessary. Deciding that he needed to look into the matter more closely, Malygos cast a spell that caused the dead mortal's stagnant blood to flow out of the corpse and coalesce into a small floating sphere. Life magic had a tendency to concentrate in blood more than any other types of magic, so Malygos suspected that a careful study of the blood could yield valuable insights. Ignoring the concerned expressions of his sibling, Malygos focused intently on the sphere of blood as he wove spells to isolate the distinct magical signature. Slowly, Malygos filtered out the necrotic and demonic energies until he was left only with a perplexing sample of life magic. Not only was it completely out of place with the other forces in the blood, but it was also so pure that it had actually coalesced into a liquid form. Malygos studied the sample for several more moments before deciding to turn his full attention to the Little Prophet's report. Alexstrasza knew far more about life magic than he ever would, so he may as well wait until he had a chance to discuss his observations regarding the plague with her before continuing. Fortunately, the Kirin Tor has been more effective than anticipated, but we doubt that will last for much longer, Krivax said through the scrying mirror from his office in Dalaran, referring to illusions being used to hide the Alliance's movements. Undead cloud serpents have been seen scouting our location in increasing numbers, so the Alliance is preparing to begin the next phase of the operation very soon. Likely within the next few hours. That was within Malygos' expectations. The Lich King's control of Pandaria's coasts, the growing portions of land corrupted by the Shah, and the ongoing war between the natives and the undead meant that there were limited areas for the Alliance to operate undetected. That the mortals had managed to transfer their forces to Pandaria for several days without being attacked was already a minor miracle. That is troubling to hear, but it was always inevitable, Alexstrasza said, her voice tinged with concern yet undeniably steadfast. What of Crossus? Has he yet managed to make contact with the wild gods protecting the mortals of Pandaria? Since the enemy was undead, Alexstrasza lacked the usual melancholy that came before they were forced to confront and destroy living creatures, a fact Malygos was grateful for. Alexstrasza was always far more focused and effective when there was nothing holding her back. Crossus has been successful in opening dialogue with the August Celestials, particularly Zuan, the White Tiger, Krivax responded, relief evident in his voice. They seem to be very glad to have assistance against the undead. By all accounts, the Scourge are quickly growing in number and power. The Celestials would not have been able to hold them off forever. Malygos nodded, somewhat satisfied by the news. Very few wild gods could even come close to matching an aspect in power, but every ally was valuable in a war against the Burning Legion's pet necromancer. Good. Then our plan is much more likely to succeed, said Malygos, thinking back to the many weeks he and Archidas had worked to create an artifact capable of capturing a powerful dreadlord. I assume that the mortals we've entrusted with the device are in position? Vizier Hadix and his team are already on Pandaria, Krivax dutifully reported. They are simply waiting for the assault to begin in earnest before moving forward. That was good. He had no doubt that things would change soon, but everything seemed to be progressing as planned so far. For the next several minutes, Malygos listened as the mortal briefed them on a variety of issues, eventually focusing on their preparations to defend against a potential counterattack. At first, Malygos hadn't been particularly worried about the Lich King attacking the mortals while he and Alexstrasza were busy assaulting the Isle of Thunder. Even if the Scourge managed to slaughter a few coastal cities, that would hardly be enough to make them a threat against a being as powerful as himself. However, Malygos had certain suspicions about the plague that gave him pause. Malygos listened carefully as Krivax detailed the efforts to defend and fortify the most likely targets for the Lich Kings to attack, which included Kultiras, Gilneas, and Stormwind. All three mortal kingdoms had capital cities which could be accessed by the ocean and be the source of plenty of undead soldiers to the Scourge should they fall. Fortunately, it seemed like the mortals were smart enough to take the threat seriously this time. Krivax had more than a few petty complaints about the ruler of Kultiras being ambivalent toward the Alliance, but it seemed like even their military had been placed on high alert. Another potential target was the defenseless orcs still in internment camps, but measures had been taken on that front as well. The fact that his flight, through the efforts of the Azure Circle of Mages, had improved the deplorable scrying magic of the mortals helped circumstances significantly. It was utterly absurd that the Horde had managed to destroy Stormwind during the First War without anyone noticing, no matter how many minds Nelthorion had twisted. Now, any significant attacks on the Alliance would be discovered minutes after it occurred. When combined with the teams of moderately powerful mortals that Krivax had prepared to respond to the Lich King, it seemed like the mortals were prepared to defend themselves. At least long enough for him to finish his business and return in time to save them from any counterattack. Oh, How Malygos wished that he could return to sleeping in his lair for decades and leaving the forces of Azeroth to defend themselves. Malygos continued to listen as Krivax elaborated on the status of the mortal defenses. Eventually, there was nothing else that they needed to hear from the little prophet, so Malygos decided to end the conversation and wait for the next phase of the operation to commence. Just as he was about to do so, Alexstrasza decided to speak up. "I don't mean to pry, but it's clear to me that something is concerning you," said Alexstrasza, her voice annoyingly empathetic as she spoke to the mortal. "Is everything all right, Vizier Krivax?" Malygos couldn't help but sigh, resigning himself to having to endure an emotional interlude while they had more important things to discuss. Given that Alexstrasza was fond enough of the mortal to offer him a sliver of her power, it was little surprise that she would be concerned for his well-being. There's nothing wrong with the operation, if that's what you were wondering," Krivax said hesitantly, clearly taken aback. "It's just, I suppose I'm feeling a bit nervous is all. From the moment I reincarnated in this world, the very first thing I worried about was the Lich King. I know that there are greater threats out there, but it was the Scourge who destroyed Nerub in the original timeline. It feels strange to finally reach this moment after so many years of preparation." Malygos hummed thoughtfully even as Alexstrasza's expression turned sympathetic and she began offering the mortal comfortable platitudes. From what he knew of the mortal, it made sense that this would feel like a particularly special moment to him. Krivax was quite young, his soul being only a few decades older than his body, so he'd yet to experience the endless cycles of conflict and resolution that Malygos and his kin had grown numb to. He wasn't normally one to offer comfort, but Malygos couldn't deny that he owed much to the mortal. "Perhaps a more practical accounting of the situation will suffice?" Malygos mused to himself. "There is little need for you to worry. You've done an adequate job of preparing Azeroth for this moment," said Malygos, interrupting his sibling's comforting words. "Compared to the events that happened in your vision, the Alliance now has the aid of both Nerub and the Dragonflights. Not only that, but the Lich King has been denied the luxury of a decade to grow and consolidate their forces on Northrend without intervention. In a direct confrontation, it is the defenders of Azeroth who hold the advantage." Naturally, there were a few negative changes which Malygos neglected to mention. The Eastern Kingdoms had much less time to recover from the Second War and the Kaldoi were much less involved with the rest of Azeroth than they apparently would have been, but those were minor concerns from his perspective. Saving Malygos from his declining sanity was of more value than any number of elves. "Make no mistake, this is not a conflict that will end quickly," Malygos continued, seeing that he had the mortal's full attention. "The Dreadlords know that they are weak and will seek to hide their pet necromancer from us for as long as possible. But you've done all that you can to ensure our plans have the best chance of succeeding. Regardless of what happens, I have no doubt that we will be victorious." Surprising even to himself, Malygos found that he fully believed his own words. Despite the many sacrifices they had suffered, Azeroth had managed to face and defeat the Burning Legion's endless waves of demons during the War of the Ancients. Compared to that, what do we have to fear from the Lich King? Turning his attention back to the conversation, Malygos realized that both Alexstrasza was giving him a knowing, appreciative smile that made him want to growl, while the mortal seemed genuinely reassured. "Thank you. That's good to hear," said Krivax, his posture relaxing. "I suppose you're right. At this point, I'll just have to trust everyone else to handle things. We're a lot better off than we would have been, and there are many competent people helping out. So, I'm sure everything will be all right." Seeing that the mortal had been sufficiently reassured, Malygos decided to end the conversation before Alexstrasza could drag it out any longer. "Indeed. If your confidence regarding our chances of victory should falter in the future, simply remind yourself that you've chosen to fight on the same side as myself," said Malygos, assuming that was the greatest reassurance anyone could ask for. "Now if there's nothing else, there are matters that Alexstrasza and I need time to discuss before our assault on Pandaria." A strange expression came over Krivax's face that resembled amusement. Before Malygos could discern what the mortal found humorous, Krivax composed himself and nodded. Of course. I will inform you the moment that the Alliance is ready to begin the next phase of the operation. Until then, Lord Malygos. Queen Alexstrasza. After exchanging a round of farewells, Malygos dispelled the scrying spell with a flick of his wrist. As the scrying mirror grew dark and Malygos was left alone with Alexstrasza, she immediately turned to him with a gaze that was still frustratingly pleased. "That was quite the speech you gave," said Alexstrasza, her eyes sparkling with warmth. "I never knew that you had a talent for encouraging people." Malygos scoffed, turning his attention back to the crimson sphere floating by his side. "It was merely an observation. We are indeed in a position to prevail against this latest threat. It would be foolish to not acknowledge it." "Even so, you did a wonderful job of raising Krivax's morale," said Alexstrasza. Her voice was approving, but Malygos could hear a hint of curiosity as well. "It was actually rather surprising. Even before everything that happened, I wouldn't have expected that from you." Malygos was both relieved and annoyed with how circumspect Alexstrasza was in mentioning his flight's near-complete destruction by Nelthorion and subsequent 10 millennia of isolation and madness. He'd been feeling better recently as he interacted with the remaining members of his flight, but that period of his life was one that he was attempting to put behind him. "I'm well aware that I've never been the most pleasant of individuals, but aren't you the one who is always telling me that I should be more courteous?" Malygos asked, turning to his sibling and raising an eyebrow in challenge. If the little prophet's visions are any indication, then it is clear that Azeroth is going to change rapidly in the near future. Is it so unbelievable that I might wish to try changing with it? Malygos had already committed himself to changing, but his conviction to do so had only grown while piecing together the remains of his flight. So many of them had been left hopelessly adrift while Malygos had stubbornly clung to the past. There had been many who had attempted to help him, to make him realize that there were still people who were looking to him for leadership and guidance. But in his grief, Malygos had pushed them all away and remained mired in his own sorrow. If he wished to ensure that nothing like that ever happened again, then he needed to adapt and grow. As loath as he was to admit it, Malygos could stand to be more like Alexstrasza, who had recently suffered the loss of her prime consort yet remained steadfast in her duties and compassion. Though he could do without emulating her naivete. "Of course not, brother. I'm relieved to see that you're doing so well," said Alexstrasza, gently placing a hand on his shoulder as she walked to his side. "After everything that has happened, you deserve a chance to be happy. We all do." For a moment, Malygos decided to simply enjoy this rare instance of peace and companionship with his sibling. Nobody else on Azeroth could even come close to understanding what he and the other aspects had endured. Not even the oldest members of their flights could comprehend the weight of responsibility that Tyr had placed on their shoulders or the world-changing decisions that they had been forced to make. Malygos was not the most empathetic of dragons, but even he could acknowledge that none of them would still be sane if not for each other. There were many reasons why Malygos hated the version of himself that Krivax had described on that fateful day in Udaman, but leaving his siblings behind like Nelthorion had done was among the worst. Unsurprisingly, Malygos was the first to grow uncomfortable and soon found himself directing Alexstrasza's attention to the sample of magical energy that he'd isolated earlier. "Enough of that. There's something that I would like you to examine," said Malygos, deciding to steer their conversation back to more important matters. Alexstrasza chuckled knowingly, but obliged and shifted her attention to blood floating by his side. "What is this, brother?" asked Alexstrasza, studying the orb as her expression grew solemn. "I could feel your concern growing the longer you studied that corpse. Is the Scourge's plague truly so deadly?" As the aspect of life, a magical plague was naturally a matter of great concern to Alexstrasza. "Before I answer, tell me what you sense when you examine it," said Malygos, deciding that he didn't want to bias his sibling's response. "Does anything about it feel familiar at all?" Alexstrasza glanced at him with a concerned expression, but she complied without further comment. Her eyes glowed faintly with golden light as she focused on the orb and called on her innate connection to life magic. Eventually, her eyes widened and she turned to Malygos with a concerned expression. It reminds me of the substance the keepers once used when they wished to create life, Alexstrasza said hesitantly, confirming Malygos' worst suspicions. I believe they referred to it as anima, though I'm not quite certain. I never paid much attention to their methods of creating life since I'm capable of replicating most of their techniques through my own power. Malygos nodded, frowning as he considered the implications. Then it is as we feared. Highkeeper Ra has almost certainly fallen under the control of the Scourge. Other than the Keepers, the only other stable supply of anima on Azeroth is the Forge of Wills in Aldar. So, that seems to be the most likely conclusion. As far as Malygos understood, anima was effectively life magic in its most concentrated and pure state. Not only was it a vital ingredient in the artificial creation of sapient beings, but it was also the substance which powered the Keepers. As much as Malygos might malign Archidas by referring to him as a golem, that was far from the truth. Despite their inorganic nature, Keepers were beings beyond even the most sophisticated of golems that Malygos, or any other mage, had managed to create. No matter how complex the magic or how valuable the materials used in a golem's construction, nobody had ever come close to replicating the power or intelligence of the Keepers. Malygos had long since concluded that doing so would be impossible without anima. Unfortunately, acquiring the substance would be impossible without accessing the Forge of Wills or harvesting it from a Keeper, whose bodies continuously produced the substance. It was clear to Malygos that the Scourge was studying the substance and attempting to incorporate the knowledge that they gained into their experimental plague. That being the case, it was only logical to conclude that they'd acquired a stable source. It seems to be just as Krivax warned, Malygos continued, recalling what the mortal had told them about Lei Shen. It was difficult to believe that a mortal had successfully kept a Keeper imprisoned in their palace, but the evidence was undeniable. If Keeper Ra was found in a vulnerable state, then it's possible that the Scourge has already corrupted him and turned him against us. Malygos was suddenly quite glad that Alexstrasza wasn't being forced to attend to other duties like the rest of his siblings. Highkeeper Ra was among the more powerful of the Keepers when it came to combat, inferior only to Tyr and Ordin. Malygos would have likely still won such a confrontation even if he was alone, but having Alexstrasza by his side would be a great help. After all, only a fool or someone seeking death would participate in a battle without giving themselves every possible advantage. Alexstrasza sighed deeply, her eyes tinged with sorrow. That is a grim prospect, but it was a possibility that we had already acknowledged during our previous discussions. We will face Highkeeper Ra together should the worst have come to pass. However, I'm much more concerned about the possible inclusion of anima into a magical plague. It is difficult to predict what may come of such profane experiments. Malygos had similar difficulty imagining what might come of it, as he knew little about anima. The Keepers were the only ones who truly understood the secrets of the Titans, and they weren't fond of sharing more than the bare minimum. Malygos made a reminder to himself that they would need to consult with Archidas for his knowledge of anima, but that would need to wait for a more appropriate time. He and Alexstrasza spent the next several hours studying the plague and learning what they could from it. Unfortunately, they were only able to discover that the plague was unnaturally virulent and resistant to life-based healing magic. In addition, Alexstrasza noticed some similarities to a disease from Draenor which the native referred to as the Red Pox. Her flight had apparently made particular note of the disease after learning that the Horde had used a modified version against the Draenei. After determining that they couldn't learn any more with such a small sample, the two of them began discussing how they would approach a confrontation with Highkeeper Ra. They momentarily considered calling for Archidas to participate in their assault on the Isle of Thunder, but decided against it. Archidas specialized in the creation and maintenance of Titan facilities, and would be of limited usefulness in a violent confrontation. By the time Krivax finally contacted them and reported that it was time for them to begin their assault, Malygos felt like they had devised a decent enough strategy. After they received the message, he and Alexstrasza immediately made their way over to the already prepared ritual site in the corner of his lair. The Scourge had erected fairly comprehensive defenses around the island, preventing access via spatial magic, so they couldn't teleport directly into the enemy's stronghold. That being the case, Malygos would be teleporting them to the island's periphery before then breaching the Scourge's defenses and opening a portal for their flight's awaiting forces. It was a simple plan, but the overwhelming power of two aspects made complicated plans unnecessary. "I suppose that it's time for this again," Alexstrasza said bitterly as Malygos slowly pushed his magic into the arcane glyphs surrounding them. "Although, I suppose I can't truly complain. Even by our standards, it's been quite a while since our last major conflict." Malygos made no comment as he quietly focused on completing the spell. Before long, the ritual began to activate and he found images of their destination being conjured in his mind. It was a rather unremarkable spot several hundred feet into the air near the Isle of Thunder. With a simple flex of his will, the two of them appeared high above the Isle of Thunder and simultaneously shed their mortal guises before regarding the soon-to-be target of their wrath. Unsurprisingly, the Scourge had done an effective job of fortifying the Isle of Thunder. Several spires emanating necromantic magic had been erected across the island, bolstering the undead troops and sustaining wards that would alert their leadership to any intrusion. Undead of all shapes and sizes moved constantly across the island as they transported materials to aid in the construction of fortifications. Skeletal cloud serpents flew through the air as they patrolled the stormy skies, while the coasts around the island teemed with undead more suited for the seas. Those would likely be the most troublesome for the dragonflights to deal with, as there was little stopping them from retreating further away from the island and harassing the occupying force at their leisure. Malygos had yet to develop an effective way to deal with aquatic enemies, but that was not their main objective for this assault. Instead, he and Alexstrasza would be focused on securing the sprawling citadel that could be seen in the center of the island, even from such a distance. The Throne of Thunder was one of the more impressive mortal palaces that Malygos had seen in his long life, surpassed only by the few created during the heights of the Kaldoi and Sandalari empires. It was all very formidable, and would be nearly impossible for a mortal force to assault without suffering immense casualties. How unfortunate for the Scourge that they were facing two aspects. "I'll concentrate on destroying the pylons," Malygos announced, glancing at his sibling. "You should focus on clearing a space of undead for the portal. Once our flights are granted access to the island, we can focus our attention on the citadel before the Scourge's leadership can muster a response." Alexstrasza nodded, her eyes fierce as she gazed at the looming fortress and the hordes of undead guarding it. "Agreed. The quicker we disable their defenses and summon our flights, the sooner we can end this and cleanse Azeroth of their taint." Malygos turned his attention back to his target, arcs of arcane energies crackling across his iridescent scales as he prepared to unleash his power. "Then let's not waste any more time." With that, the two aspects dove toward the Isle of Thunder, their massive forms leaving behind a trail of magic as hurtled through the sky like twin meteors. Each of them was completely focused, ready to fulfill their roles as guardians of Azeroth. The undead reacted instantly as Malygos and Alexstrasza passed through the wards surrounding the island, rushing in the general direction of the intrusion with complete lack of fear. This only made it easier for Alexstrasza as she flew above the coast and unleashed a wave of vermilion flames, sweeping away any undead in her path and purifying the land beneath her of necromantic magic. Malygos ignored his sibling as she landed in the center of a Scourge fort and roared so loudly that it could likely be heard for miles around, focused entirely on his own task. Deciding there was no need for any complex spells, Malygos channeled his immense arcane energies in a beam of concentrated power as he flew over one of the pylons. The structure withstood his attack for several seconds longer than he expected, but eventually exploded in a shower of debris that rained down below. Without a moment's pause, he moved on to the next one with the intent of destroying them all as quickly as possible. At the same time, Alexstrasza effortlessly cleaved through dozens of undead with a sweep of her tail, obliterating their bodies beyond what necromancy could animate. The Scourge attacked them both with everything they could possibly muster, from hails of arrows to modified siege weapons that launched foul alchemical filled with dark magic. Even the very skies seemed to turn against them as lightning fell down upon them from the magical storm above the island. The attacks were so strong that even they began to sustain minor injuries, but it wasn't far from enough to prevent them from fulfilling their objectives. With each passing moment, the Scourge's defenses fell one by one. The pylons shattered under Malygos' relentless onslaught, their magical energies dissipating into the atmosphere. Alexstrasza's cleansing fire left entire swaths of land free from undead, her life magic anathema to their twisted existence. Lightning continued to rain down on them from above with increasing frequency, but Malygos was soon able to conjure an arcane barrier above them that deflected the onslaught. Malygos was able to trace the source of the storm's power back to the Throne of Thunder, and knew that none of them would have peace until they secured the citadel in its entirety. Eventually, Alexstrasza succeeded in carving out a massive clearing, leaving it completely devoid of any undead and covered with patches of newly grown vegetation left behind by her flames. At the same time, Malygos destroyed the last of the pylons, effectively neutralizing the magical wards that protected the island. Without wasting a moment, Malygos landed next to Alexstrasza and began the next phase of their plan. The members of their flights ready to participate in their assault were all gathered and waiting at the Wimrest Temple, where the most skilled members of the Blue Dragon Flight were prepared to assist in the creation of a semi-permanent portal. With so many powerful mages working toward the same goal, it hardly took any time at all before a violet gateway began to manifest before Malygos. The portal shimmered into existence, revealing legions of armored draconids and dragonspawn that quickly began streaming through, weapons at the ready as they moved to secure the island. The older and more experienced dragons took to the air the moment they passed through the portal, engaging in combat with any aerial undead who might threaten the advance of their ground troops. Although it had been many millennia since the dragonflights had truly gone to war, Malygos found himself somewhat satisfied by the coordination of their forces. There were many places where they could improve, but that would come with time. Malygos would have preferred to spend his time studying the effectiveness of their flights, but the magical lightning assaulting their position showed no signs of stopping, and even he could not maintain a barrier in perpetuity. The Scourge's ability to attack them constantly with such powerful lightning only made him more confident that Highkeeper Ra had fallen into their grasp. After all, there was a reason that Ra had been referred to as the Keeper of Storms. Malygos had no desire to be pushed to exhaustion before he faced such a formidable opponent, so he turned to Alexstrasza and with a mutual nod, they spread their wings and began flying toward the Throne of Thunder. Both of them steeled themselves, preparing for the battle ahead with the knowledge of how much was at stake. Securing the Throne of Thunder was one of the most important steps that they needed to achieve if they wished to defeat the Scourge on Pandaria. The only other mission of equal importance was the one being made by the mortals to capture one of the Dreadlords. Should they succeed in both, then gained a massive advantage in this war before the Lich King could accumulate enough power to become a threat to Azeroth. Malygos had no idea if the mortals would succeed in their objectives, but he had no intention of failing his. Hidden beneath an invisibility spell, Krivax watched from atop a hill overlooking the battlefield as the Alliance experienced their first clash with the Scourge. The Alliance had managed to establish a sizable base of operations before they were inevitably discovered by the Scourge several hours ago. Many lines of fortifications had been hastily erected, Nerubian efficiency allowing the Alliance to build more robust defenses than one would expect in such a short time. Several large trenches dug by Jormungers had significantly dulled the first wave of undead, the creatures being destroyed by the hundreds as they were blown apart by the dwarvish bombs, gnomish landmines, or magical traps that filled them. Those that hadn't been destroyed by the traps had found themselves trampled by their fellow undead, until all of the trenches were eventually filled by corpses. Once the Scourge passed the first wave of defenses, they were then met by a steady stream of ranged attacks from the Alliance. Kirin Tor mages sent torrents of fire into the approaching undead, Nerubian viziers turned large swaths of the earth into mud, and a barrage of gunfire tore through the ranks of the Scourge like a scythe through wheat. In the air, elite Nerubian lifeweavers along with several dragonhawk riders and griffin riders battled with the undead cloud serpents. Those on the ground helped out in the aerial melee by shooting bullets and missiles whenever one of the cloud serpents got too low to the ground. Krivax observed a Lifeweaver equipped with specialist enchanted armor effortlessly hack off the arm of a cloud serpent in a single pass before swooping back down to impale it through the head with his spear. It was a formidable display of firepower that offered Krivax a glimpse of how they could have survived against the Scourge in the original timeline. Equally clear, however, was why the Scourge was such a serious threat that the entirety of Azeroth would need to rise against it. Relentlessly charging up the cliff upon which the Alliance had constructed their base, the Scourge moved on unyieldingly. Unless their bodies were dismantled completely or an attack managed to destroy their heads, the undead simply ignored minor inconveniences such as bullet wounds or missing limbs. Even with the Alliance's impressive powers, it was the Guardians of Nerub and the Knights of the Silver Hand who were most effective at holding back the ravenous undead. Nerubian in particular was a terror on the battlefield, glowing brightly with the light as he burrowed his scythe-like arms into a sea giant and tore the undead in half with a single, fluid motion. Overall, Krivax found himself confident that the Alliance would be able to successfully withstand this assault despite the Scourge's relentless advance. The Alliance had chosen to construct their base in a location that was both rather defensible and quite far from the bulk of the Scourge forces. Given that it had only been a few hours since the Alliance was discovered, the enemy commander had almost certainly been caught off guard and decided to attack with whatever forces they could gather. Coupled with the ongoing attack on the Isle of Thunder, he had a feeling that the Scourge leadership wasn't having a particularly good day. Krivax would normally be doing what he could to help in a battle like this one, but that was not currently his role. He had two primary reasons to be on Pandaria, the first of which was his normal diplomatic duty of negotiating with the natives. It was good that Crossus had successfully made contact with Zuan and the Shadow Pan, but there were certain things that he simply lacked the political authority to handle. Naturally, any such negotiations would need to wait until a later point when the Scourge had been pushed back and the Alliance had fully established themselves. However, it was Krivax's second objective which held much more importance. "Come now, apprentice," said Vizier Hadix, his stern voice cutting through Krivax's thoughts. "I believe you've watched for long enough. The Scourge's numbers are already beginning to diminish, so there's nothing left here to see. We must leave soon if we are to reach the Dreadlord's most likely location in any reasonable time." Krivax turned his attention away from the battlefield and looked to the other people also being hidden by an invisibility spell. When Krivax had first gone to Malygos and expressed his desire to capture a Dreadlord, they had spent a significant amount of time going over the specifics. Although Malygos could easily overpower any of the Dreadlords controlling the Lich King, preventing such paranoid and cunning demons from escaping was no simple task. At the slightest sign of someone like Malygos approaching them, the demon would undoubtedly teleport away and cover themselves with countless layers of anti-scrying spells. To prevent this, they had come up with two solutions. First, Malygos and Archidas had created a powerful artifact that would apparently completely restrict the Dreadlord from escaping. Not only would it prevent any teleportation, but it would even capture any untethered souls in its vicinity. That way, they could simply kill the Dreadlord without allowing it to return to the twisting nether. Something about the artifact's construction did mean that they needed the assistance of Ionaya to activate it, but Krivax wasn't going to complain about a Titanic Watcher helping out. Secondly, Malygos would quite visibly be showing himself on the Isle of Thunder, far away from the Dreadlord commanding the Scourge on mainland Pandaria. While they hadn't narrowed down the exact location of their target, simple deductive reasoning had been enough to get a decent idea of the demon's general location. Even with magic, the Dreadlord had to be relatively close to the bulk of the Scourge forces to lead them effectively, which excluded the Throne of Thunder. That being the case, the Dreadlord would very likely be in the largest and most defensible Scourge location on the mainland. Malygos had also noticed a distinct bloodthirstiness in their strategies during his observation of Pandaria, so the demon would likely wish to be close to the fighting anyway. It was this ambiguity in the Dreadlord's location that led Krivax to join the mission when he'd much rather be organizing things with the ADF aside from Alexstrasza herself, There were very few people who could match his innate sensing abilities. Even most members of the Red Dragonflight couldn't sense life magic with his degree of clarity. So long as he got close enough, Krivax would be able to instantly lead the team to the Dreadlord's exact location. The rest of the team had also been chosen for similarly specific reasons, ensuring that they would have the best chance of delving into the heart of enemy territory and living to tell the tale. All right. I suppose you're right. It would be best if we finished this as quickly as possible, said Krivax. With a nod, Hadix called for everyone to gather around before beginning to cast a teleportation spell. They would need to travel on foot under an invisibility spell once they were closer to their destination, but there was little sense in them traveling for what would be days unnecessarily. With a final glance to the battlefield, Krivax resolved himself for the mission ahead as the familiar feeling of the teleportation spell pulled him to lands teeming with nothing but the undead.